It is a book that's had a huge global impact on the thorny political debates, the gap between rich and poor. The book is called The Spirit Level, subtitled Why Equality is Better for Everyone. It's done for equality what you might say what Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth did for climate change, raising the issue's public profile, but at the same time polarising opinion and becoming a political punching bag. For example, in the UK, the New Statesman loves the book, Spectator says throw it in the bin. British health statisticians, Professors Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, waded through social data from the world's 23 richest countries. They looked at life expectancy, mental illness, obesity, crime rates and so on. Their discovery? It is not the richest countries that perform best. Instead, the countries that consistently have happier, healthier populations are the ones with the smallest gap between rich and poor. Equality, in other words, is king. Now, maybe the most surprising point of all, in the most equal countries, it wasn't just the poor who do better, but the middle and the upper classes are happier as well. New Zealand has, since the 1980s, it is said, become one of the least equal developed societies, raising the question whether that's hurting us and each and every one of us. So on Friday, Guy and Espin spoke to Professor Richard Wilkinson in his Yorkshire home and asked if the professor was saying that those social ills are directly attributable to a lack of income equality.
Yes, and what we've done is look at the rich developed countries and we find the ones with the biggest income differences between rich and poor do worse on a whole range of health and social problems. And they have more violence, they have more drug problems, they have lower life expectancy, they have more mental illness, many other things. We not only looked at it amongst the rich developed countries, but as a sort of check on these relationships, we also looked at it amongst the 50 states of the USA as a sort of separate test bed and find just the same pattern there. And in a way, what we're saying and what the data shows is that intuition that people have had for centuries, that inequality is divisive and socially corrosive, is truer than we ever imagined.
I wonder whether you believe that this theory is being played out in some of the modern events that we've seen, such as the London riots.
We don't look at data on riots, though other people have, and it's quite clear one of the precipitating factors is our cuts in government expenditure. I suspect also high unemployment. Some of the kids involved in these riots were very young. And youth unemployment, if you look at the unemployment rates among 16 and 17-year-olds, it's about 40% nationally. And of course, in the more deprived areas, it'll be a good deal higher than that.
If we look at New Zealand, we've had a rapid rise in inequality over the last couple of decades, and we're one of the more unequal countries in the world, where the richest 20% are something like 7 times better off than the poorest 20%. Do you believe that New Zealand would be a healthier place with fewer social problems if we had reduced that gap?
Well, of course, there are a lot of other things influencing all these kinds of problems. But inequality seems to be a common factor, and it is very clear that countries, more equal countries with narrower differences, do better. And so this will be one of the factors influencing levels of violence and health and so on in New Zealand. It may not always be the most important factor, but it's one of the powerful influences.
I guess when you look at the countries that you've studied, these richest 23 countries all have a degree of inequality. Even Japan has something like a factor of 3 or 4 between the richest group and the poorest group. You could argue, couldn't you, that in order to get rich, you need a certain degree of inequality?
Well, many people have looked at the relationship between the amount of inequality and economic growth. There are papers that come out on either side of the argument, but it seems to me slightly more come out saying that greater equality is good for growth. And that, I think, makes some sense because we know that in more unequal countries there's less social mobility, kids' maths and literacy scores are lower, and so in a way the more unequal countries are wasting a lot of their talent. I think that in the long run is a cost and is likely to reduce economic growth.
I guess a lot of people would look at this equation of equality and wonder whether it's better to live in a society where, say, everyone has an income of $20,000, or is it better to live in a society where the poorest person earns, say, $40,000, yet the incomes range up to $1 million? In other words, is it better to have equality, or is it actually a matter of how well off the poor people are?
Well, one of the reasons why we look at the richest countries in the world is that amongst those, national income per capita no longer seems to make a difference to levels of life expectancy, to infant mortality, to measures of well-being and happiness, or indeed to things like the UNICEF measures of child well-being. Countries like United States, which are very rich, do badly on almost all those measures. Countries like Greece, Israel, Portugal, only half as rich as the US, do often as well. And the more equal of the rich developed countries do consistently better. So it looks as if, in poorer countries, obviously, where many people haven't got basic necessities, it's important to raise material standards, and that has all sorts of benefits. But for us in the rich developed world, having more and more of everything seems to make less and less difference to the real measures of human well-being.
One of the other things that strikes me when I look at your book and your work is that the more equal countries are also the ones with a more homogenous population. So if you look at Japan or Finland or Norway or Sweden, they tend to be the countries with less immigration. And you look at your more unequal countries, United States, Britain, New Zealand, Australia, they tend to be countries which have taken in more immigrants, or countries which have been colonised and have an indigenous population which is still struggling to come to terms with that. Did you look at that factor in your work?
People have often raised this issue, and it's been looked at in the wider research literature, and it doesn't explain the effects of inequality. But actually, the patterns that you assume in your question aren't as clear as I think people imagine. So if Sweden has the same proportion foreign-born as the United States, the biggest immigrant group into the United States are Hispanics, many of them from Mexico. And although they're uniformly poor and badly educated, their health is as good as non-Hispanic white population of the US. One of the really important issues which may help you understand this is that the benefits of greater equality are not confined to the poor. So it's not simply a matter of how the poor are doing and whether there's a high proportion of immigrants amongst them. We all seem to do better in more equal societies, by which I mean that given a person's social class, their income, their education, if they're in a more equal society, they may live a little bit longer, their children are likely to do a wee bit better at school, they'll be less likely to become victims of violence or teenage parents and that kind of thing. In that sense, we all do better in a more equal society.
So do you believe that at its root there's something inherent in us as human beings that strives for equality and justice? I mean, is it jealousy or envy? Is it the negative sides of this? I mean, what is it about societies which you think sort of makes them fall over if you have this big gap between rich and poor?
I think it's more to do with feelings of superiority and inferiority. I think as the material differences get larger, the social distances get larger, and all the signs of sort of social class differentiation increase. And people feel more disrespected, looked down on, and issues like that. I think that's really the core of the thing. And you see its effects on involvement in community life, the strength of community life, or how much people feel they can trust others. In more unequal societies, the quality of social relations deteriorates. It all falls away. Community life is weaker. People don't trust each other very much. And in that sense, it really is about the real quality of life, the important quality of life for all of us. And increasingly, that is a matter of the kind of social relationships we have in our society. You know, whether you feel safe to walk through any of our major cities at night. You would feel much safer in one of the more equal countries to do that.
I guess one of the other criticisms is that you've left out a lot of the poorer countries, in fact most of the poorer countries, and you've left out China, which is moving from a communist phase, which presumably people were more equal, into a capitalist phase, which I imagine is increasing the gap between rich and poor. Yet they would argue in China that they've lifted out a lot of people from poverty, and that their economic reforms and the way they organise their economy now is actually doing good things for their people.
Well, the few Chinese I've talked to have say the quality of social relations has deteriorated quite substantially as they've become more unequal. But again and again, people read our book and they think that ours is the only evidence that inequality is damaging. In fact, there are about 200 research papers in the peer-reviewed journals looking at the relationship between measures of health and inequality. There are about 50 papers doing that with levels of violence and inequality. And many of them using much more sophisticated measures and a number of them including much poorer countries. So that even if you look at the provinces of China, it appears that the more unequal ones have worse health. If you look at rich and poor countries together, you have to control for GNP per capita because it's still important in the poorer countries, but on top of that, inequality seems a powerful influence. So you shouldn't look at our evidence and think it's the only evidence. It's our book, really, what's important about it, it takes a picture that's been coming together in the epidemiology and shows, using the same group of countries, the same measure of inequality, one problem after another is worse in the more unequal countries.
Just finally, have you been surprised at the politicisation of this work, that both the left and the right have jumped on this work? And have you been surprised by the amount of controversy and debate that it has generated?
Well, yes, we were very surprised by how much attention the book received, but also surprised that it seemed to be welcome on at least the centre-right as well as the left. Cameron, in the early stages of the last election campaign here, quoted the book and mentioned it by name, saying that we showed that by almost any measure, countries with bigger income differences did worse in terms of the quality of life. And it's been taken up by the leaders of the other parties as well. The criticism has come from the extreme right, and they have attacked it in any way they think they possibly can, but often ignoring the fact that there is so much more academic work and research that supports this picture.
That's Professor Wilkinson. Lots to chew on there. We've got 3 copies of the book to give away, so if you'd like to win one, send us your address. You can text your first name to 8850 for 50 cents. Email us at Q&A@tvnz.co.nz, or we're on Twitter @NZQ&A. So any one of you who contributes is up for, we'll do the draw at the end of the program, and we have 3 copies of the book.